than, let's say, minus 5,000, but still it would be of comparable protection for salmon that are in the delta at the time. And that's something that we're trying to craft the dynamics around in terms of some modeling to work with NOAA Fisheries and Fish and Wildlife Service and State Fish and Wildlife to say, hey, if we get this circumstance and it's capturing some intermittent flows into the delta, is there a way that we can maybe pump a little harder or work through those kind of flows coming up and down where we go from one objective, let's say early on, is the outflow objective under D1641 as modified, but then we get a brief period of time where it's the ultimate river flow from the biological opinion that's governing, and then we're back into potentially the modified delta standards. During the period that's the OMR constrained, looking at that more globally, is there something we could do that allows us to capture a little more of that water? And I know it sounds like we're saving our nickels and dimes, but they will tend to add up through this sequence. And I think that's how we're learning from last year. And I'll just add the third thing, and there's probably some scenario that we haven't thought of yet that will probably present itself. And I think we've got the teams thinking out of the box at this point, and the technical resources ready to go in case that does come up, and we'll want to respond to that. All of that with the mind of, there's probably some nits and gnats of flows that we can pick up, so we don't get caught up because the TD, and this is not a knock on the process. The process needs to be there, but it can be rather a lot of inertia to overcome. To craft, okay, what do you want, you operators, what do you want the change objective to be if you can't meet the objective as written? So we craft that, then we do some modeling, then we think about the biological effects, and we talk with our biologists and the fish agency biologists about that. If you follow that too much of a linear fashion, you can't change roads very quickly. And I think we're having to do both the appropriate lead work as well as being prepared to change on the fly as the conditions come up.
Great, helpful. Thank you. Glad we took the time, and thank the rest of you for your patience. Hopefully some of you had at least some of the same questions that we did, and more. So with that, I'm going to move to the speaker cards, and I'm going to say 5 minutes for each. It's a complex arena, and in this there are people at varying levels of both understanding and perception as well, but I won't get into that today about what's happening, and it's totally fine. Whatever you throw into the mix, anything that we should all be thinking about as we move into another potentially awful year, because everybody's just trying to figure out how to manage this as best we can. And the relationships among the team we talked about are important. So are the relationships between all of us and all of you, and the varying people I know who are either listening on the web or sending some of you as their emissaries. This really was a group effort on the fly, and this is partially an attempt to be able to have more public discussion about it so more people understand the various competing issues, and everybody is invited to come up with a better idea on just about everything. So our first speaker is Ron Jacobsma from the Friant Water Authority, followed by Jeffrey Volberg of the California Waterfowl Association. Hi. You may have come the furthest. I'm not sure. I haven't surveyed the...
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I don't have that rock star thing down, but I have been mistaken for some of the Breaking Bad characters lately, so I don't watch the show. I don't know if that's a good thing or
you should
not.
just wear sunglasses, and everybody would think Bono. You can do it, however. Bono, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you for having the opportunity to address the drought plan today. My name is Ron Jacobsma. I am the general manager from Friant Water Authority. Was really hoping we wouldn't have to be meeting with you all this year, given the very critical nature of last year's water supply. And moving into this year, Friant is in just as a precarious situation as we were last year. Maybe even more so, because our reservoir has even less water in it than it did last year. As you know, thousands of rural residential homes are without water. We have small communities that were provided some modest M&I water last year to get by, cities of Orange Cove, Lindsay, et cetera. It goes on down the list. We had tens of thousands of acres of permanent plantings that were narrowly preserved. Some of them had some production, some had to be weight trimmed back, some were rotated out early. but we're running out of our reserves. Our duct tape and baling wire approach is just about exhausted. So as we move forward this year, we're again going to need some of those critical supplies. And one of the things that really struck us last year is while there was a lot of interaction, quite candidly, it seemed like ag was not really in the mix when we talked about trying to balance the needs in very limited supplies. And because we seem to always get close and never quite be able to get over the hurdle. It was the first time ever the exchange contractors weren't able to get substitute supplies out of the Delta. And we all know we're in a drought, and I think we have learned a lot since last year. I think we can be more responsive. Some of the Fish and Wildlife Service additional monitoring has been helpful. It was with great interpretation that we didn't oppose restricting pumping. It was a bird in the hand, but at what price? It could be expensive insurance. Hopefully it's going to pay off down the road. We can't have another zero allocation this year, which means we have to find some way to get the exchange contractors their water supply. So as we move forward, as you know, and part of your responsibilities is finding that balance. How do we have the stewardship on every precious drop of water that we have? How do we find the competing balance, including critical agricultural needs? And as we make concessions in one camp or another, I think some extent there may have to be some mitigation required in order to try and balance things out over time. In other instances, if there's kind of a no harm, no foul, then maybe we can get more flexibility out of the system. For instance, if we have a reduction in outflow, if that's in the mix, and it's not demonstrated to prove any harmful effects on the fish agencies or the fish populations, should there be a payback, or can it be paid later, or what does that all look like? Because it seems sometimes last year when we got some flexibility, there was a price to pay at the end that really never advanced the ball with respect to water supplies for the ag community. So I think some of the things that are positive, we're generally supportive of the plan as we move forward. We look forward to the flexibility. We look forward to this growing interagency cooperation. Anything we can do to continue to enhance monitoring, not only for the smelt, but also for the salmon. If we can get quicker, more timely genetic testing, because we're not sure which salmon are sometimes being taken. That may mean we were taking more or less than what we really think for some of the protected species. When we have storm events, I'm hoping we can be more responsive and get the pumps cranked up earlier and get water moving across the Delta, still being conscious of where the fish are, and that all fits into the monitoring. So we're going to be happy to participate with this board's efforts, with the staff's efforts, obviously with the operators. I don't know how many calls a week we have already. I think that's very helpful as we start to move forward for this year. But I would just remind folks that agricultural supplies also support communities, and those groundwater reserves that otherwise get depleted obviously have an impact on not only rural residents, but also these smaller communities, which probably have the least ability to be responsive for finding some other alternative source of water. So with that, we stand again ready to jump in and help describe our situation, help to work towards resolution of some of these issues, and I hope we can achieve what, from our perspective, maybe a more balanced approach, a more responsive approach than where we ended up with from our perspective last year. So thank you for your time, and look forward to working with you down the road.
And thank you. As we're delivering water to those communities that you're talking to, we're acutely aware of that problem.
Appreciate it. And appreciate you all coming out, or some of you coming out to see the area firsthand. Very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeffrey Volberg, followed by David Guy from NACWA. Hi.
Hi, Chair Marcus and members of the board. Let's see, I'll try to get this microphone. Thank you for giving us the opportunity. I'm here
Sorry,
to...
I was going to ask bird questions, but I knew you were here and the time was short, so I didn't.
Well, you know, I'm hoping that when Ron said no harm, no foul, he wasn't speaking about waterfowl, but I'm here to speak in support of the drought contingency plan with respect to the refuges. I think it covers the appropriate policies toward refuges and waterfowl water needs, and includes a couple of improvements over last year's thinking and plan, those being that it provides and calls for more seasonally balanced deliveries to the refuges. Last year, we lost out on a lot of the summer irrigation for food production for the birds, and this year, the plan at least, obviously the hydrology will dictate how this works out, but the plan at least calls for a more balanced seasonal delivery of water. The other thing that the plan calls for that has been a kind of a long-running discussion but has never really become as critical is the question of reallocating level 2 supplies, particularly across the delta from north to south, because as Ron pointed out, south of delta is a lot more difficult situation for refuges and for agriculture than north of delta, particularly in this year. The Grasslands Water District and the south of delta refuges only got 65% of their CVPIA level 2 supply, which according to the CVPIA, they were entitled to 75%, and they were only able to get 65% because plainly the water wasn't available. And of course, the level 2 supply is really only a baseline supply. So when you got 65% of your baseline supply, you're hurting. So we're looking at and hoping that this idea of reallocating level 2 supplies from those refuges and wildlife areas that don't have the delivery capacity in the north to those that do in the south would be an improvement over the existing situation. So on the whole, I would like to say that this drought contingency plan from the standpoint of refuges and waterfowl is a good one and contains the appropriate principles, policies. So thank you.
Good, thank you. That's very helpful to know. David Guy, followed by Steve Chedister.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Marcus, members of the board. Appreciate the opportunity to just make a couple of comments. First, just want to note, I think what's obvious to a lot, I think the conversation this year is taking place much earlier than last year, and that's just been a very positive thing. I think the drought contingency plan that we're talking about, I think, is a really good body of work that is now, I think, you know, again, earlier getting some conversation going. So we really appreciate all the efforts of the folks that have already presented. There's also an effort going on amongst the various contractors throughout the state, both state and federal. Many of the folks are here today to have conversations as well with a lot of modeling support. So again, I think there's this really good, solid engagement, and I think that will obviously help inform us as we go forward, not knowing what the rest of the year is going to look like with respect to precipitation. Two quick observations with respect to the Sacramento Valley. And today in the audience we have Louis Baer and Roger Cornwell, both settlement contractors that can speak if there's any questions. Also MBK, Mark Van Camp, Walter Beret, and Anquidar are here as well, have been doing obviously a lot of analysis. And two things just want to highlight. First is, in our view, it's been suggested, but getting water backed into Shasta as soon as possible. I think a lot of the way we think of this is kind of stepwise, and to me that's kind of the first step here, is to put as much water into Lake Shasta, as been described earlier, as possible, because at least what we have seen is that the earlier you can get that water into Shasta, the better chance for the cold water pool and getting that water above the shutter, all the things that you were that were discussed earlier. So we really encourage the water board to help with that as much as possible. To us, that's the next important step. Second thing, as far as an observation, just on the discussion earlier about the depletions and accretions, I just want to make sure that we're clear that this past year, the Sacramento River settlement contractors did prepare a diversion schedule early in the year, and they did meet that schedule. There were no surprises there, and in fact, MBK has done an analysis of that and has provided that to your staff, and I think they're reviewing that as we speak. So I want to be careful that we're not somehow creating an issue with respect to accretions, depletions that isn't really something out of the ordinary. And so anyway, I think that's a discussion we'll welcome with your staff on a more technical basis if that works. But if it's important today, we can have some conversation there as well. But let's not make that, I think, an issue that doesn't, that isn't real. So anyway, I'll stop there and would, if there's any questions, would welcome that. If not, we look forward to working with you as we kind of understand this year a little bit better.
Well, I would appreciate if you'd just elaborate a little bit more. The depletions were underestimated by the projects from the SAC. So what's your,
Yeah.
how did that happen?
Right, because it's not just contractors who take from the SAC.
Right,
It's-
exactly.
I didn't take that as anybody pointing any
Yeah,
fingers at the
can I invite
contractors.
Mark Van Camp to
Sure.
speak to this?
Sure.
I think that he would
Because
probably be the
I
best.
think this is important. I assume the same would be true in the Delta.
Yeah, it has to do with accuracy of information.
Mark Van Camp, MBK Engineers. I think the biggest point I want to get across is the black box that was referred to. I think a lot of work went into trying to break that black box down between natural accretions and depletions versus diversions by the contractors. We know what those diversions are. So they're not thrown into this uncertainty. That's the natural accretions, depletions.
But what about diversions from people other than the contractors? The contractors aren't the only people on the Sac River.
Since we do not have a good handle on those.
That's what I took
Maybe
them to
your
be
staff
talking
has a
about.
better handle on those than us, but we have to throw those into more the natural category. But from a Sac River contractor standpoint, which represents a very large portion, that number is well known.
Okay.
It'd be good to get an idea of the order of magnitude, those that we don't know.
That
versus-
has been provided. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. We shared it with Ron, the Bureau of Reclamation, last spring. We've gone back in 2014 and did a look back with the actual data for 2014, and we think we're in pretty good shape. Sure, we have recommendations for this coming dry year if it stays dry like it appears to be.
Good. And then how far back does that record go? Because you mentioned 2014, you feel you've made some significant refinements, which is
Well,
great. But how far back would you say you have the diversion quantified with greater confidence?
Well, the contracts were established in 1964. The measurements may have gone back to, well, they started then, but we probably used 1970-ish data up to present.
Okay.
So a good period of record on diversions.
And could you comment on how this fits in with curtailments, if at all?
Well, keep in mind, the Sac River contractors are senior water right holders that are agreed to a certain amount of water with the Bureau of Reclamation under contract.
I'm actually referring to the others, the other diverters.
Yeah, you guys are focused on the contractors. We're focused on everybody else, I think.
That's a very complicated question that we've been working with your staff on relative to your database and using the database as a demand in certain years versus other years. So we've been trying to work with your staff to improve that demand and how that looks relative to supply, when to curtail other water rights.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your efforts to work on sharing drops of water with fish last year. That was a great story. Next, we have Steve Chedister from the Exchange Contractors Water Authority, followed by Colleen Flannery from the North Delta Water Agency.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon. Thanks for driving up.
Well, thanks for having this hearing, allowing us to have the chance to give you a little update of where we are on this operations plan. You know, I make a comment. When I first started coming to these hearings, I didn't need these, you know, and now I'm finding out that
I'm using
I-
mine more
I
too.
do. So you've heard earlier, so some of the advantage of going a little bit later is you get to sort of back up what others have already said. So you heard earlier from Ron Jacobsma and from David Guy, there's been a lot of coordination that's going on that a year ago, we didn't have any conversations with our other contractors, to be real honest, except for ourselves and maybe some other south of Delta ag service contractors. We are very supportive of the contingency plan that's been put out here today or on the 15th. It's just a start. You've heard that already. This is a good start. It's got forecasting in it that is, you know, almost 3 weeks old. And so, you know, you've got to be very dynamic and open to what you're getting started now. Let's see how it plays out through the rest of the year. You know, I know we've got to make plans, but we need to make sure that we maintain flexibility so we can anticipate and take advantage of events that occur. A lot of coordination. We talk with not only our CVP brethren, north of Delta, south of Delta, east, west. I mean, we're all talking and have conference calls and meetings 2 or 3 times a week on calls and a couple of times a month, direct meetings with our consultants and modelers, trying to compare, okay, state, what are you looking at? What are we looking at on the Fed side? And so how does it mesh and how doesn't it? We also are meeting a lot with our CVP, Ron Milligan, and I know the state contractors are talking to their state contractors, same, John Lehigh. Our goal, though, is just, I want to get it across, it's been mentioned twice. Our goal is to maximize flexibility. You've kind of heard part of it already from Ron on some of the things we're going to need this year for, laid out for some of you TUCP. And what we don't want to do is end up on a hard line 1,500 CFS max. You know, I mean, maybe that's the bottom, but you need to let the projects, along with the contractors, come together with a plan that's maybe a little more flexible in that aspect of it, so we can get further exports, so we can deliver water to the ag service contractors both on the east side and west side.
Can I ask a question? I
Yes.
don't need to, I can ask at the end. I don't
No.
want to interrupt your train
Good.
of
No,
thought.
no, you go right ahead.
So I know that's great that those conversations have been happening. Have you had the chance, I know the projects have been also meeting with the environmental community. Have you guys had the chance to have that conversation in real time with members of the environmental community so you can craft it together? I know you've been meeting with the fish agencies, I assume, a bit too. Because the only way this
no.
works is everybody holds each other's goals in mind and then comes up with a better solution. I mean, one of the things that happens in the absence of information is that people will argue to one side and always feel they get cheated. That is true across the board in this work. And I think the more conversations you have together and help resolve it, you might find more win-wins. So that would just be my request. Can't make it, but that would be my request to figure out how to do that.
That's a good, it's a good request. I would say most of our conversations have been, if they are with the fish agencies and that, not other environmental agencies, just to be.
I mean, I know I'm always a matchmaker. I
Upfront.
want everybody to have coffee together and everything. This is like for 20 years, but I've seen remarkable things come out of it when people, it doesn't have to be everybody, 100 people in a room.
Oh, right.
It can
Well-
be small groupings.
And the obvious match is the bird guys.
Well, it's not just the bird and the fish guys.
Well,
Both.
no, I'm saying because of Jeff Volberg and
Yeah.
the comment that he made,
Yeah.
you know, as far as a need to move water south, where there, you know, could be, it'd be great to see more common goals, like what you see in the Sac Valley, and I know the situation is very different south
Right.
of Delta.
Right.
It's different south, but I've got one of my contractors here who actually works very closely with the refuges and wheels water to them. So, I mean, there's a
Right,
lot
yeah,
of
right.
coordination that does take place
Right.
between the refuge managers and our local districts. So that does take place.
Well, and
We
I think.
actually share a adult beverage every once in a while and talk about it. So-
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we're very familiar with that in the Sac Valley, but, I mean,
Yeah.
I know that goes on south of Delta, but it might be helpful at some point for you guys to come in together to let us know about, you know, what you're doing on a voluntary basis.
That's a good
Sorry
suggestion.
to interrupt. I just couldn't wait.
And again, I think to close it off, our main issue is that we want to make sure there's a balanced approach. You know, agriculture is very important to us, obviously, and to everybody else. You know, of course, M&I and the environment, which is refuges and fish. So, and we look forward to working with Ron and the state contractors and put together a program that we can all support. And we want to be here if every month or every 2 weeks, whatever it takes, to show you, hey, we're still making progress towards a plan that we can all support. And that's our goal.
Thank you very much. Okay, Colleen Flannery, Assistant Manager, North Delta Water Agency, followed by Terry Erlewine, General Manager, State Water Contractors. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome.
Chair Marcus, you were just discussing the importance of collaboration, and I wanted to add my voice to that choir because recently, at the request of North Delta, the department added to the drought contingency plan some statements that indicate it intends to fully comply with the North Delta Water Agency's 1981 contract with DWR, and we want to publicly thank them here and also let the board know why it's so important that, these statements were added. The North Delta Water Agency contract acts as kind of an insurance plan for the farmers and other landowners in the North Delta. And during a drought emergency, the farmers and others are protected in the event of certain changes or damages to the crops they choose to plant. And the contract makes it clear that a drought emergency only exists under specific conditions. We're not at all sure whether that will be triggered this year, but it seems unlikely. We won't know for sure until May. These conditions are different than the conditions that the governor uses to determine whether there's a drought. And the department has agreed to work with North Delta Water Agency regarding the development of an MOU to ensure the contract is complied with in the event of a drought emergency. We appreciate that, and we really eagerly anticipate these negotiations. The plan also discusses the contingency installation of emergency drought barriers at Steamboat and Sutter Slough between May 22nd and October 1st. The agency continues to discuss the barriers with the department because of landowner concerns about the potential for crop damage due to increased salinity and isolation. We'll continue to ask that barrier-related water quality or water quantity problems be monitored, mitigated, or avoided. We were glad to see in the barriers portion of the plan that the department has recognized the importance of the 1981 contract compliance, even as it contemplates the installation of the barriers under a 99% scenario. Because of what we've seen in the drought contingency plan, we remain hopeful that mutually acceptable agreements can be reached concerning 2015 state water project operations as they relate to the agency and its landowners.
Great, thank you. Thank you for coming. Next, Terry Erlewine, followed by Andrew Fecco from Placer County Water Agency. Hi.
Hi, Chair Marcus. Terry Erlewine, State Water Contractors. First off, I'd like to add on to what the other comments you've received about the level of coordination this year.
I'm pleased to hear
I
it.
think last year was a real wake-up call. The water users hadn't coordinated as much as they probably should have with the water projects, and we hadn't coordinated with each other. And we're really working hard to make sure that doesn't happen this year. A lot of coordination south of Delta, north of Delta, projects and contractors. So I think we're all on the same page. We all think that the contingency plan that's being presented, it's the results of it don't look great for anybody. You know, it's
Right.
not what we'd like to have, but I think
Right.
we all understand why it is what it is. In a lot of the discussions, I think there's a common understanding among all the water users too about the need to keep stored water wherever possible, and wherever we have a chance, like through these temporary emergency change permits, to modify outflow standards and keep water upstream, keep it in storage. That's going to be good, because when it's in water's in storage upstream, it's available for all kinds of purposes: cold water pool, outflow, water users upstream, so on. The export water users, state water contractors, and the CVP contract users in the south of the Delta, they're all still hurting. We're relatively better off with a 15% allocation, which is still one of the lowest ever for the state water project.
I think
CVP
it's
contract.
third lowest, I think. Is
That
what
sounds about right. I was
Director
counting on my
Cowan said.
fingers while we were there, and I couldn't remember a whole lot of other years. The CVP contractor south of the Delta, they had a zero allocation last year, likely going to have a 0% allocation this year. We would like to see some of the balancing that was discussed earlier for export users, and I think up till now there's been consideration of the fisheries needs and consideration of health and safety, but I think there's some real critical economic needs, and I think it would be good to throw that in the mix. Ron's idea of looking at some sort of a sharing of water between the maximum and minimum outflows, we would support that.
Can I just make a comment? Your opinion's your opinion. I'm sure there are other people who'd come up and say we threw the fish under the bus. So it's sort of, I just need to make a statement that I think people held agriculture, economics, and people very strongly through it as I watched us go through it. So I just want to say that. You feel however you feel, but I don't want to let it go so that people listening think that people didn't care about ag, because a lot of us cried about it and worked on helping. So I think people did the best they could. I think people, hopefully with all this experience, we can do better.
I think maybe the visibility of it could be, a little bit improved. And then the other thing that's happened is you got people with 0% allocations, and so that's just not, that's not a world that they've ever lived in before. And I think there's a lot of really desperate folks out there. And I understand that the fisheries are, not doing great either. We're all in this together. The last thing was on turbidity. We talked a little bit about that, and the state contractors have been very supportive of the actions taken. We think this probably helped out this year, but I think in the end, it just reduced the amount of water that we lost. So there was about 300,000 acre-feet more outflow, a result of export cuts. Even with the turbidity actions, would have been more losses over if it hadn't been for that. And then the other factor this year is that even though this year is probably a pretty negative year to implement it in some ways, because what you're really hoping for is that you can moderate your pumping, keep the turbidity out, keep that turbidity gap in place, and as a result, you'll actually have the hydrology cooperate, and you'll get about 4 months of real high outflow, and you'll get to take advantage of it. This year, that didn't pan out. We benefited somewhat, but it could have been a lot better than it really ended up to be. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. Andrew Fecco, Placer County Water Agency, followed by Doug Obigi from the Natural Resources Defense Council. Oh, we outlasted him. I apologize. We didn't. Mr. Obigi.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus and members of the board. I'm Doug Obigi. I'm a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I want to first thank all the agencies and the board for preparing this plan in advance. One of our key asks, and I think you guys really did the right thing for asking for a plan in advance and really a worst case plan. Obviously, none of us wants to be here. It's been a terrible couple years. I think I'm one who, like DWR, really looks at this as 7 of the last 8 years being below average with 1 good year in the mix. And so we are really approaching a situation where this is starting to become the new normal. And I think with that in mind, we need to think about how we plan for the future, not just for this year, but for future years. Given that our fisheries are at really all-time population lows in terms of delta smelt at its lowest abundance level in the fall midwater trawl, longfin smelt at its 3rd lowest level, I believe, and losing something like 92% of the winter run last year with similar losses for fall run likely, we do need to do better on all sides. The projects were able to deliver nearly 4 million acre-feet of water to irrigated agriculture last year, but much of that, all of that went to senior water rights holders, and that is the seeming inequity of our water rights system, that some folks get nearly all or all of their water and other folks get 0. And it really does seem unfair, but it is the kind of thing that I think the board needs to take into account. And as folks just mentioned, we need to talk about where the water went last year and how we managed water, and really make sure that folks do understand how little went to the environment. We didn't use all of our CVP IAB2 assets, for instance. We only used about 2/3 of them last year. We had no pumping restrictions for delta smelt last year. Different this year, obviously. And I have a very different take on that December action by Fish and Wildlife Service. The environmental community is very unhappy with the way that that's gone down, but we'll be following up with the agencies separately on that front. A couple recommendations going forward. One is that the board really should do, and the agency should do a better accounting of where the water did go. We did a mass balance last year for February 1st through April that we presented to you that found that 2/3 of the water was stored or exported. And we should be doing that kind of analysis so that folks understand that. And so, the department, the Bureau has done a really good job of reporting their allocations to senior contractors and juniors, and DWR should do the same with its settlement contractors. Because I know, I'm an expert, and for the first 5 years, I didn't realize that there was over 1 million acre-feet of water being delivered on the Feather River to settlement contractors. That's part of that picture that we all need to understand. Second is that we need to prepare for this drought to continue. And I think one of the challenges and lessons learned from last year is that we didn't manage, even though we conserved 450,000 acre-feet by reducing outflow, we still weren't able to meet temperature compliance at Shasta, and that had devastating impacts on winter run.
Right.
So I do think that the board should set a reservoir storage requirement at the end of the year and ensure that any conserved water actually gets added to the projections of end of September storage so that we actually end up in a better position than where we were. That gives us water to make sure we go into 2016 with some emergency and health and safety supplies as well as protections for the environment. Second, I strongly encourage the board to look at the hydrology as it changes. Obviously, January's been terrible, but when considering the temporary urgency changes, we need to make sure that we really are dealing with critical conditions. You know, under the 75% forecast as of January 1st, it wasn't even going to be a critical year. The 50% forecast was a below normal year, 75% was dry. That's obviously changed. You know, everyone would love to have that 50% forecast that had a 45 to 55% state water project allocation. We're not likely to get there. But when you're looking at temporary urgency changes, we need to look at how does that mix in terms of allocations and supply and hydrology, because obviously it's really about dealing with the extraordinary circumstances. And we recognize that there will be needs to conserve water upstream. We didn't oppose some of those changes last year. Finally, in terms of exports, you know, I think we have real significant concerns, particularly given the precarious nature of our fisheries, about going more negative than minus 5,000 OMR for these storm events, for the way that we I think, in my view, we kind of gamed the EAI ratio in Decision 1641 last year, the way that we calculated it on a 3-day moving average versus the 14-day, so that it always was the higher amount of exports. You know, as the state starts to look forward to whether this is the new normal, whether we're going to have to change the water quality control plan, we want to make sure we're not having to do these kinds of changes all the time. You know, we're trying to have some flexibility, but when flexibility means that we're ignoring the biologist's advice, that really undermines that trust and that relationship with the environmental community, and it undermines the trust for longer-term solutions where folks say, we will follow the rules. These kinds of experiences are really informing the public. So with that in mind, I really encourage you to look at hydrology and look at setting storage targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being so thoughtful and coming. I know there's more folks in the audience who could speak too, but that was a helpful range. Do you all have any closing thoughts or questions? I wanted to give Mr. Lawfer and Tom and Karen, I guess I should be formal, Mr. Lawfer, Mr. Howard, and Ms. Turgovich, any guidance to us or initial thoughts on what to think about as we go into this. Obviously, there's a lot more work to do. The purpose of this was just to illuminate what came in with the drought contingency plan and get suggestions, but I want to give you your chance at a couple of cents, and Ms. Riddle too, of course.
And if I could,
Yeah, sure.
I think that it would be helpful, not only has there been a big improvement on coordination within the agency, between the agencies, but also with the stakeholders, but also I think with transparency. And so anything that you could do to comment on, you know, assuming that we do see these TUCPs, what do you expect the process to be going forward so that the public can be aware and prepared?
Well, regarding process, you know, in the past, as the projects have indicated, I think it's very likely when I look at the hydrology, when I look at the weather forecast, that they say that they might be submitting a change petition, and it seems like almost a certainty that they will be. In that regard, the sooner that they submit it, the better, since they want it to go into effect on February 1st. And I think it would be nice to be able to have a chance to let people comment on what conditions should go into a temporary urgency change petition. We really didn't have that opportunity in the past. And so I think that the projects are probably intending to request some sort of reduction in delta outflow in February and March. And, you know, as Mr. Obigi indicated, he's interested, and I'm sure others, in, well, what are we going to do exactly with that saved water? There are obviously the number of different things that it can be used for. As you back water up into storage, that the opportunity exists to deliver that, especially to in-basin purposes, or it could perhaps be saved for purposes of temperature control in Shasta, specifically set aside for that purpose. And so these are kind of conditions that we want to be able to consider, and I think it would be good to have an opportunity for others to comment on it as well. So that's, right now it's the 20th, that's 11 days from now, is I suspect they're going to want to have something going into effect. So it wouldn't be a very good idea necessarily to see this petition on January 30th. I do think it would be advisable to let folks have an opportunity to comment on it.
Yes, even if you have to do it as an emergency change, and then we decide and try to hold hearings as we can.
Well, it is
But
our...
you need comments from everybody. That would be different.
We are tentatively setting aside February
Right.
18th for the board to hear any
18th.
petition that any petition for reconsideration that people might want to file for any action that I might take, depending on what the temporary urgency change petition that we get submitted to us. So in any event, whether I take an action or not, I think it would be good for the board to have an opportunity to hear the issues associated with the temporary urgency change petition and to take that up in some sort of proceeding on February 18th.
Anything else?
Anything further, Karen?
All right.
Did you have any specific questions?
How would we go about, and this is to Diane as well, setting reservoir storage requirements? I mean, just take that as one example of something that's been thrown out. How would we do that?
Well, of course, there are
Michael?
targets in the biological opinions of 1.9 million acre feet, but that's a lot higher in the kind of drought that we're looking at potentially than we're probably likely to be able to achieve. And so I believe that's a target, is it not, Ron, in the biological opinion of 1.9 million acre feet?
It is a target, and with the idea of preserving water for drought, and actually it's a sliding scale to some degree. However, the difficulty is when we get into a year like last year, which was, gee, if you let no water out of the reservoir, you couldn't get there. So balancing the needs of the fishery, at least with minimum flows, in the year you're in, year zero, versus how much of that do you save for the subsequent year. I think
That's
the
right.
question would be, if last year we had no relaxation or modification to the outflow objective, I can't remember, John, we had thought about, let's say Shasta's example, probably would have started the summer with a couple 100,000, if not maybe closer to 300,000 less acre feet in Shasta, which would have just magnified the cold water pool question, and we
Right.
would have come in at the end of the summer that much lower. So, not that we've gone through an exercise. The hard part is, okay, what would you have done if you did not have a change in the objective, and then where would you have come out? To be honest, I think the run that we did for the 90% exceedance probably had what appeared to be around the end of September, around 1.9 million acre feet. Now, that would probably on the surface be something we'd want to continue to look at, because that sounds like a lot of water
It does.
under the circumstances. But at the same time, given the dynamics we talked about with cold water pool management, it would have been hard to push more water out over the summer and spring, let's say, to deal with deliveries and still try to meet a temperature objective in the 90% exceedance. So
Which
we're going to
is-
have to keep teeing that up. But to some degree, that dynamic is also going to have somewhat of a regulator on the amount of water that ends up in Shasta. I mean, if we were just saying, theoretically, refuges south of the Delta and exchange contractors being at only 65% and the tremendous amount of water being brought over from the Friant system to meet a portion of the exchange contract, if we didn't have any real concern about temperatures on the Sac River, we would have just released more water out of Shasta, even though we had high depletions in Sac Valley, to make that delivery work. But that would have driven us down much, another 500,000 acre feet, 600,000 acre feet from where we were. So we would have been getting close to territory where 500,000 at Shasta go into the next year.
Yeah,
These are all just, oh, I'm sorry. These are all just operational decisions. There's a lot of factors that go into it. I mean, that's part of what it takes to manage a project. Consideration of holdover, carryover.
So we're kind of juggling those. I think our approach last year, when the question came up, is there an appropriate target at Shasta going into the next year? Our approach was, let us think about this from a management perspective of the temperatures and the water that we have, and then look at that snapshot and say, gee, does that seem like that's enough water in case we get a 99% exceedance in this year to meet the minimal health and safety? And when we were coming in around 1 million last year, it's the estimate, we thought that was adequate. And I think we'll do a similar exercise. I don't think that'll be as much a concern given the December inflows we had. Shasta had close to 800,000 acre feet of inflow of increased storage over that period of time in December.
How
So
much?
that's about 800,000 if I
Yeah,
recall,
great.
which is great. That just meant it all flowed into the reservoir at one time. There's no snow or anything behind that, but that does take a little bit of the edge off, I think, that carryover for health and safety next year. But I do think that I would use that not as the front end target, but as something you check on the back end to make sure that
Right.
you haven't put yourself at too much risk of the subsequent year.
Yeah, there's the health and safety side, but it seemed, as you described, you've learned a little more about that thermocline management as far as, could you use that as a management target, sort of an adaptive management target as the summer goes by, and keeping an eye on where the temperatures are in relation to the structure?
And that's more or less, as Tom referred to, the target that's in the current biological opinion. But that was also kind of thought through. This is the target to kind of set when you have some control, so that when you get into the 3, 4, 5-year drought periods, you've got something to start from. And the problem is we're kind of in the throes of it as right now.
Yeah, so even, because I realize for simplicity and for predictability, you have certain set procedures, but is there some kind of dynamic factor you can bring in, to step things back if you're approaching that, those temperature thresholds? Because it seemed like, looking back last year, there was a point where we just lost control in August because the exceedance was not as median, and so there isn't really a way to be more dynamic in how you release
I water. think it's too late by August, and
Yeah.
I'm sure will confirm.
Right. So can
It
you
is.
anticipate that in June, in May, and can you do a stepwise?
Well, I think the process would be within the Sac River Temperature Task Group. Let's say we get into this because we've set a location and a temperature, let's say, and we get a month into it and said, boy, this is going to be real hard to maintain that. The question becomes, do you target a little higher temperature or move your compliance point upstream? Now, last year, as an example, we were already pretty far upstream. So that was going to be difficult. If we had said earlier, rather than 56, let's try to meet 57 earlier. The problem with that is that has its own set of dynamics in terms of mortality of the reds. So it's kind of, I don't know if it's one way after the other, but it is difficult at the trade-off at that point. We didn't have a lot of room. If we had set the compliance point down at Balls Ferry and said, gee, let's move this up to Airport Road, then that would be the type of flexibility we would ordinarily have that discussion. But we were already up to basically the minimum number, and your options at that point, none of them were good, regrettably.
So my question is, when are the models going to be changed to reflect the new hydrology that we have with climate?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask that.
When? Who's in charge of that?
Climate girl beat you to it.
Well, I don't have an answer to that question, but just a couple of other comments about the, going into the future here and some of the constraints that we're operating under in this system. And one that Michael just reminded me of, and one that we had discussed before, is that it would be very nice if the water board, we could receive from the projects perhaps some options regarding TUCPs predicated on, well, first off, based on various alternative types of operations, and secondly, based on the various hydrologies, so that instead of us having to try to do, make a new TUCP update every few weeks, there would be an opportunity for the board perhaps to hear that if it stays really dry, this is what we're going to need. If it's just dry, this is what we're going to need. And if it's 50%, this is what we need, and we're asking you to approve all those things now, so that, there would be a fuller picture of what was going to be happening for the remainder of the season under various hydrologic circumstances. Another thing, when you had asked about how to set targets, everybody focuses on, for storage, everyone focuses on end of the water year storage of September. There's been some discussions, I understand, among some of the folks who are looking at temperature control about trying to set end-of-month storages so that you actually try to manage more on a real-time basis, and try to reflect what's actually happening in the hydrology. And of course, the problem with that is what I was going to make is my next point, which is that in a lot of the time, when we have these conversations, it seems as though the system is highly constrained. And really, probably the biggest constraint that's put on the system is the assumption that in-basin contract deliveries are going to be met pursuant to the contracts. I mean, it isn't really laid out very clearly, I think, in the drought operations plan. I think the department makes it clear that that's their intent, to provide 50% to the Feather River, or 100%, because that's what's in their contracts. And I assume that the CVP will make every effort to meet 75% for assuming less than 3 million acre feet into Shasta, or 100% of their settlement contract deliveries. If you use that as your base, well, that's a lot of water, and so there's not a lot left. And so that's when we start talking about trade-offs between, fishery flows and exports. But of course, there's already this base of some pretty substantial in-basin deliveries. And I think that the projects probably rightfully, since they have contracts, feel constrained that they have no option to discuss anything but what's in their contracts. To what extent the water board has the ability to do that, I won't speculate, but it does seem as though, if you're wondering why the system seems as constrained as it is in dry years like that, I think that's probably the principal reason.
And Michael, could you opine on if we wanted to move into that territory, could we?
Well, I mean, the grounding for it would be Article 10, Section 2, but it would be unprecedented for the board to go down that route. But it's always an option on the table, and it was something that was discussed last year to great sensitivity. The benefit we have this year moving forward is we have a drought operations plan on the table that at least already lays out those options, which will hopefully forestall us having to look at that most significant step, if you will. And I just want to supplement the one point that Tom had made on my behalf. I mean, part of my goal from a process perspective by trying to have the TUCPs potentially packaged up so that the board is considering options comprehensively is, last year we were from a process perspective, we didn't have the benefit of the drought operations plan that we have that we have before you now. And it really meant that there was a lot of ad hoc decision making as the TUCPs came in, and that also really kind of frustrated the process because it was a shifting target as to what was subject to objections and petitions for reconsideration to the board. And to the extent that everything gets packaged up, it makes it much more likely that the board can meet its 90-day time frame for having a comprehensive order on reconsideration, which will allow everybody certainty as the water year progresses as to what the board's position is.
So does that mean that you need something let's say next year in November?
No, I'm referring to with respect to the TUCPs we'd see this spring.
This is still a year-by-year thing, starting in January.
Yeah, I think given the nature of the temporary urgency change process, given the nature of, the executive orders that we have to rely on, we're not looking at long-term changes, which is what you'd be talking about in November. I'm referring to how we adapt to the emergent situation we have on the ground from the hydrology perspective this year, this spring.
Right. I mean, at least doing this early meets the Water Action Plan goal of trying to plan for droughts, but we all have a need and a promise that we've made that we are going to plan for drought. So that is going to be short-term. Long-term, we may not be able to do it all in 1 year, though. We got a lot on our plate just to catch up with this year.
So I'd like to just address what Mr. Howard just said, and I know it's not before us right now, but I do think since we're all here together, I want to use my opportunity. I think I follow your line of thought here on constraints in the system as a whole. But if we look at the impacts south of Delta, it would just constrain things that much further because we are talking about a water rights priority system. So if we were to condition something on a trade-off with respect to settlement contractors, then it would just create a domino effect that much further with respect to the other contractors, kind of looking at, say, the Friant. It's a domino effect because of the call on Friant with the exchange contractors, and what got them there to begin with was a constraint on the system. So if we were to look at settlement contractors, it would be that much more so.
Yeah, I wasn't speaking so much to the issue of the senior versus junior contractor issues that exist, which, I think we're all well aware of. I was speaking more to the issue that in many cases when people come forward with TUCPs, they describe the situation as a conflict between different environmental standards, Delta outflow versus cold water pool in Shasta. Right. Leaving aside the fact that there is this large delivery base that is not really mentioned as being one of the drivers of the need for these changes. And so I wasn't really trying to opine on us making changes that would reflect, on exporters, but more just the way the discussion goes about the, what is available for amendment in the system, and it's usually characterized as a conflict between environmental standards.
With respect to how it's framed.
Yeah.
Is what you're talking about.
I'm not sure that's necessarily true to the extent that the exported water is natural and abandoned flow. It wouldn't be storage releases that would then be going to the settlement contractor. So I'm not sure. I mean, there may be times for the 1,500 CFS base flow that they want to pump where you would have that conflict. But to the extent that the remainder of the pumping that they're planning to do is natural and abandoned flows, I don't think you would have that conflict because it wouldn't be a storage release to support the exports anyway under any scenario.
One of the themes that's coming out of Australia and other discussions we've had all year, is just, and even today we heard about, concerned about the quality of information and sort of comparability. And one of the journeys we took this last year was a journey with our urban water suppliers and setting up a structure and being really engaged in this process, but coming up with a way to compel the furnishing of quality data on water quantity and water use so that we can make conclusions about how we're doing and evaluating ourselves as a state in the urban sector. And so we heard some comments just now about from Mr. Obiji about his concerns about the quality of information. But at the same time, I hear that from people from across the spectrum. So as we go into this TUCP process, I'm interested in opportunities we have just to refine and make our data comparable. So, we were talking about the quote-unquote black boxes. That's just, our interest here isn't in trying to point the finger or blame or anything like that. It's just getting good information so that we can, express quantities of water with confidence to people. And I think we've achieved that. Our track record is good, with the urban water suppliers. We're still, cutting our teeth on that and improving that process. We haven't mastered it by any means, but we've, I believe, achieved a quantum step as a state in terms of having comparable statewide information. And I kind of look to you, the project operators, in helping us through this process identify areas where we could make certain information reportable that you may be already collecting, but maybe serve as a catalyst to improve the comparability of at least the state and federal water project data, and then any other information we feel we need more to have better information on, not just have a coefficient or an assumption of depletion, but move us forward toward getting more useful information so we can move toward that goal that I think was achieved or is being achieved in Australia and other states. Even Chair Marcus mentioned meeting with other states in her board report earlier today, and the quality and reproducibility of information on water use that's needed for us to really achieve that goal of a water budget that's a statewide water budget. Do you have any thoughts on how, through our regulatory actions and reporting requirements can help you furnish and move toward more data comparability?
Well, for myself, what I'm taken by is someone who queries CDEC significantly, looking for different things, both that might help influence a decision, whether it's at my kitchen table and I get frustrated, how come I can't get into the system quick enough, or whether it's my desk, I'm just trying to get to the computer downstairs for CDEC. I think there's a lot of information there, and I think part of it is, and it's really good information, our difficulties sometimes are being able to do forecasts and all the different moving parts that go into when we make these references to black boxes. That's just code for saying there's a lot of moving parts there, and it's really hard to forecast the pieces. But what I do think is that we have really good gauging information that's telemetry now that we can get. They either go into some accounting mechanisms between the two projects or otherwise, and maybe it's just a matter of crafting which of this, find the needles in the haystack. There's so much data there, and all of it's really good data. What's really pertinent to the decision-making process that we have before us, particularly whether it's a temporary urgency change petition or otherwise for some project operations. Now the struggle is those things are a little bit of a moving target. Flows at Freeport may be really a key factor for a 2-week period, and then it becomes, okay, what's the flow at Wilkins Slough, for example, or what's going to happen, projection at Vernalis, per se. But I think maybe trying to figure out what those things are, and maybe a discussion about, in our world of social media, is that we just have some people say, gee, what's hot right now? What are the things that people really should be looking at and tracking in terms of a decision for operations over the next 2 weeks? But I do think there's a lot of data out there. It's a matter of compiling it and putting it together in a format that I think, as Chair Marcos said, well, there are folks out there that are maybe less informed about this, or those who have been looking at this for 20 years. But what's the key parameter out there that we need to look at? And that's what I find striking in what I do, trying to communicate to my policymakers is, okay, what's the thing that we should be looking at, that we're not looking at the thing from 4 weeks ago
Right.
as the key parameter?
Well, one of the things that seems to me that we're really not looking at land use very much. We're looking at water, but water and land are very interconnected. And we're not looking at land use, I don't think, as much as we should be. And certainly land use is having an effect. I mean, there are changes in how much land is being used for permanent crops, for example, or for multiple crops. or moving into urbanization. I don't know. But it just seems to me that land use is one of those black boxes that that we need to be getting a handle on, because it is having an effect, and it's going to have an increasing effect.
I think for reclamation, and it's a little more on the macro level or at the district level, we have a lot of conversations with our different districts about the land use question, both in terms of are their demands hardening, and it has sometimes a lot to do with, they come to us and really reflect this as it kind of accumulates across a district level, the timing of when they need water. And unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily come across as, oh, guess what, we have more flexibility now. It's actually that they have less flexibility and wanting to know if we can accommodate them in a little bit better way. And these things do kind of accumulate over time. Now, I don't know how to forecast that necessarily in a good way, or even what to do with it, but we are at least having the conversation about it. When it gets to a big enough sense from a CVP operational standpoint, a lot of times our water district customers bring it to us and say, hey, here's what we're seeing. I think a lot of our work with the Sac River settlement contractors this last year, trying to understand their operations and timing, has been very useful in the communication of what will benefit the project and its management of, let's say, cold water resource, and what can we do to kind of knowing that their operational perspective as to what they need and what can they realistically do in terms of shifting their demands, and not creating another problem 6 weeks later. Because we could say, okay, the problem is you guys are diverting water in April, so let's move these things down the calendar a bit. Well, that creates another dynamic that we may not have thought about, as you still got to keep enough water in the river 3/4 of the way down so that you're not limiting habitat, or another subsection of the senior guys with their pumps all of a sudden, hey, I've never experienced this before, but low water levels in the river are affecting our ability to divert. So, this is kind of described as the whack-a-mole, or you have lots of unintended consequences. You deal with one thing and something else will inevitably pop up.
Yeah. There are so many layers of literacy that we don't all have. It's been interesting to watch people seeing different slices of it. I think some of the suggestions on information or telling the story, or people who do or don't understand water rights and the seniority system and all that, we still want to solve all these problems. And it's just, it's fewer people can get into the mix because it's so detailed. I've rarely found people who know it from all the different lenses around it. And I think part of what we're trying to do is to get more of us, and I include myself in this, literate with the things that different people see, so that we have more people trying to figure out how to manage either the whack-a-mole situation or just figuring out, as we're going to need to, how to get to adaptive management scenarios in other contexts. It does require the collaboration that you all have really done a fabulous job on, and the engagement of everybody. I mean, we have a shot at making some progress on this, but it's hard. Yeah, it's hard. One final question. I know probably we've exhausted everybody. Listen, we didn't talk as much. I mean, I thought this was very nicely written. I want to thank you for writing it in a very intelligible way, everyone, and also stopping to explain some things like what the exceedances mean, but also acknowledging all the challenges. I was impressed with that. One of the things you talked about there, and we talked about all year, as the prime thing, but we haven't talked about as much today, and it doesn't mean you have to, but I just want to mention it, see if there's anything you want to add for today, is maintaining salinity control in the Delta, because that's what the big driving force was in a lot of the outflow standards and other things, which was just the point that if we lost salinity control, that, as you said today, that water wouldn't be good for ag or urban use in the Delta or beyond. I think John may have said it, and we just didn't end up focusing on that. And so in this plan, you feel, it sounds like you have enough of a target so that you want to have what you have in storage so that we don't run into that situation. And if we do, I'm just saying, if I'm getting this right, then you'll consider the barriers. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I think you've got it exactly right. So, it's just really, it's a function of how much storage we're projecting that we're going to have to work with through the coming year. And so this last round of studies suggested that in most cases, we'd be okay. And even the 99%, it's not entirely clear, because it's not a straightforward answer, because you've got the trade-offs between the temperature management that we're talking about.
Right.
You could, in those types of scenarios, you reach a decision point. Are we going to release that storage to maintain salinity control? Or are we going to hold on to that to avoid a catastrophic temperature outcome on the Sacramento River? So that's why we have, as a placeholder, the emergency drought barriers in that 99%, because that's right about where you start reaching those decision points and those very significant trade-offs. Even this last year, that was one of the drivers for Shasta releases. We were at the point in June where we were very concerned about the salinity intrusion. The state project started making the brunt of the increase in releases to maintain that salinity. We reached the point where we had some limitations on our release capability, and Shasta actually had to make some increases to help provide that salinity control. So to a large extent, some of this becomes, you're right at the margins about what these trade-offs are. And certainly that's, we came close to that point this past year, and we're identifying the potential for that as a conflict this coming year as well.
Can you speak just briefly to what Tom raised in terms of the contract setting a base that's quite high? And so then the balancing occurs above that, kind of not necessarily directly above that, but you don't go very far down into the contract amounts. Is that something that how do you handle that at the department or at the Bureau?
Well, I don't think I can comment any more than kind of what, Tom's thoughts were on it. As far as the department's concerned, we have a contract that we're meeting there.
I think there was plenty of pain to go around last year. It was just
Yeah,
horrible,
absolutely. I think it's clear that that everybody took a hit on some level this past year. There was certainly a lot less rice put into production this last year. We didn't have the storages at the end of the year that would have been available for say rice decomposition.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't there. So there were cutbacks that were made that were effective in place there. So I think that there was pain at, like I said, at various levels.
One of the
Being
things,
it is getting late, I guess all I would add to that is there's also the dynamic of transfers.
Mhm.
If you change those quantities, and if this is a question of just where do you start with where the water is initially, just to make a plug for the market forces, the source or the seller of a lot of transfers this last year that did get some water to some different places came from this array of settlement contractors.
right.
And if you change that whole dynamic of the transfer market would be gone. And now, does that get replaced by something else? And that's really part of what the dynamic has to be that comes into play here.
Yeah, we probably need to figure out how to do a less than 8-hour water rights, contract rights 101 for a number of folks. But
Sure.
there's all these basic, I'll call it a literacy module that would have more people having the same conversation versus.
And I hesitate even talking more about this because we'll probably get a new round of cards from the audience.
I know, well.
No, I'm
what-
done. I'm about to
what-
close out.
One of the things that would help me on literacy is incidental benefits. So I'd like to get some information on whether or not there were actual deliveries to the SAC settlement contractors, separate and apart from the incidental benefit that they received after they, timed their diversions to coordinate with the fish agencies.
That's sort of the same as the incidental benefits to fish and outflow. Is it the fish standard or the salinity control standard? It's like there's double duty for
Yeah.
the molecule, so
Yeah,
it's not like one or the
guess-
other. Maybe I'm not understanding the
I guess
question.
my question is, whatever they received, did those molecules do double duty? Or did they receive allocations where they only benefited?
I think I follow the question. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit hard. I mean, we can line up timing from our perspective. I think some folks would say, well, did that release of 7,000 CFS at Keswick, did you really need every CFS of that for the temperature there? Or could it have been 6,500? But one could say the timing. I think that we have looked at this before is, hey, were there times clearly outside of that it was really clear that that was a dynamic? And I think that's where I say, compared to 2 years ago, April 2 years ago, that a lot of shifting was done. And I really applaud the settlement contractors on the Sac River for kind of coming together and recognizing that they could not do business that way and really wanting to understand how they could make a big difference. And I think if you look at those two things, you could say a world of improvement in terms of how they did their operations. Does that mean that they completely shifted so that they were completely within the, eclipsed within operations of temperatures? Probably not, but I don't know if that's entirely feasible given just the timing of having to do the farming operations that they have and the needs for permanent crops. I think a lot of shifting was done for things like rice, but the permanent crops in a dry spring are just going to need a certain amount of water, and as it gets a little warmer, there's not a lot of shifting you can do with that. And, probably some of our Sacramento contractors could kind of say, yeah, we pushed as hard as we could push, knowing the problem. And maybe they can think about this from a lessons learned, but I will applaud them that the amount of movement from 2 years ago to last year was huge under very similar types of conditions in the spring.
We're looking as many of those double, triple duty use of the same molecule as we can. Would consider this an open invitation to anyone with a great idea. All right, that was very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for all the hard work that you all did. Thank everybody else for their attention, suggestions, comments, cautions, etc., as well as to staff. We have our work cut out for us, but I appreciate there are more we's in this and folks talking, and that is very encouraging. So this was very illuminating and a good foundational meeting. Appreciate all the time that you spent. And with that, if you're all right, I will adjourn the meeting.
Recess.
No, recess the meeting.
I will recess the meeting till tomorrow. I do have a question. We have the closed session on the agenda after our priorities discussion. I would prefer reversing them, but I didn't know if there was a way because some of us do have to go to a meeting at noon, and I'd rather press our internal conversation than our closed session. Okay, so we'll reverse the order and we'll resume with the closed session unless there's a problem at 9 in room 230, right, or 240?
Yeah, we'll take care of appropriately posting when the open session begins, closed session adjourn. We will retire to closed session
Okay.
then when the open session resumes again.
Okay, so do we need, I need to come in and open the meeting and then go to closed session? Okay, thank you.
Cal Recycle is going to be using this room at 10, so when you come in,
Yeah.
you'll come in open, and then we don't come back in here because we don't have the room anymore.
They've given the room to Cal Recycle.
All right, but there'll be something on the website or in a note on the door telling people? And so when we shift from, that we're in closed session, we shift from closed session because we don't know when we're done. Let's try it for an hour, but we may want to go longer. That's the target I have.
And we'll put signs, even though we're saying we're meeting at 2:30, we'll put signs on the doors.
Perfect, good, great. Thank you.